We've got 3 great presentations lined up for you about various different approaches. We're starting off with, I'll pass this to you in a second, with Professor Jenny Lunsford talking about the value of interdisciplinary teaching. Dr. Nick Lambert is going to talk about economic history and its ties to naval history. And then finally, we'll talk about aviation history and its role in naval history with Dr. Bill Trimble. So we'll start off, Jenny, with Dr. Jenny Lunsford, who is Associate Professor of History here at the U.S. Naval Academy. She specializes in early modern maritime and cultural history, especially the history of piracy and age of sail warfare. She holds a PhD from Harvard University, was a Fulbright Scholar in the Netherlands, and is the author of Piracy and Privateering in the Golden Age Netherlands. Her commentary about piracy has appeared in media such as Time, NPR, The Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, the Houston Chronicle, the Baltimore Sun, and the Voice of America. She also has served as an interviewed expert on history programs for Netflix, National Geographic Channel, Smithsonian Channel, and the History Channel. Currently, she is writing a new book about piracy, completing a study about early modern sailors, and is engaged in research projects about women and piracy, the Naval War of the Glorious Revolution, and the French role in the Naval War of the American Revolution. So, pretty busy. She lives in Annapolis, Maryland, with her husband and 4 children. So, without further ado, Jenny.
Hi. I need a wipe. Hi. All right, I've got 2 sort of apparatuses here, so let's see how I do. All right, so you heard the intro. My training originally is in early modern cultural history, which makes me, by definition, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So that's always been the way I've approached subject matter. And I got into naval history sort of a backdoor way through history of piracy and privateering. So it's always been part of what I do. Now, once I've been at the Naval Academy, I had this sort of wonderful, fortuitous email from a colleague, now retired in oceanography, who had questions about the Battle of Flamborough Head, which is American Revolutionary naval battle between the Continental Navy with John Paul Jones and the Royal Navy, HMS Serapis, and his question was about looking for the wreck of the Bonhomme Richard, who sank during that engagement. And that, of course, is a very famous battle when Jones says, "I intend to go in harm's way, and I've not yet begun to fight." Very famous battle, but we haven't been able to find the shipwreck. Now, some people claim they have, but it's in dispute. So through those conversations, we actually came up with the idea of having a course that we would combine together to bring all of our strengths to offer this course at the Naval Academy. And we actually pulled it off. It took quite a bit of planning, and I'm going to that's my segue into talking to you all about how to bring interdisciplinarity into your classroom. But I realize mine is a specific, not every institution can necessarily offer such a course. So I'll try to give you some food for thought for your institution as well. We were combining, in our case, history, oceanography, and ocean engineering. And I'll come back later on in the presentation to show you how we did that exactly. This is actually the course description for MIDS. It runs off there at the bottom, and you can see the whole name of the course was a multidisciplinary perspective. All right, so why should you teach an interdisciplinary course? Let's talk about that. And you can also say multidisciplinary, same thing. I would group it into 3 reasons, and the 3 Ps, if you will: practical, pedagogical, and personal. So let's start with the practical. And first of all, especially after we know the 2008 recession, we lost a lot of history majors in institutions. And the sense was, wow, college is expensive, we have to go to a place where we will pick up practical skills. So I think it's not a bad thing for us to showcase what we can give to students by working with other disciplines and show the utility of history to others. We really do have great transferable skills, and we can showcase it better to others if we're working outside of our own department sometimes. It also shows your institution that you can do this, all right? And that can help with things like funding and support and everything else. Practically also, you can broaden your base of students. There's some folks who consider, they think naval history is, somehow arcane to them, like they don't understand it, they've never done it, and you are meeting them where they are if you reach out and they meet you in a different discipline. All right, Pedagogy, though, I think is the big one that really resonates. So I'll have a number of slides. Here's a great quote by Einstein that really all types of knowledge and experience are coming from the same tree. So first of all, students can more easily relate perhaps to your subject matter if you've got something multidisciplinary going. It may resonate with some experience they've had in their life or maybe something that they're majoring in and they never thought of applying it to a naval history or military history example. When I say naval history, I am including the Marines, okay? Hoorah, absolutely. Semper Fi, all right? Yes. So when I say naval, y'all know you're part of the naval service, like a crucial part of the naval service, and I'm including our Marines. So you also help students, actually this gets into, and I didn't put all the footnotes, but there's been a lot of work on if you have students who've had prior experience in something and then you expose them to new material, they learn the material better because they're building on pre-existing neurological networks in their mind. So if you're going to bring new history content to them, they're able to receive it if they're doing it in a way that's multidisciplinary and connects with what they've done. Okay, so one scholar talks about connecting these disconnected little islands of information in their brains. You also help students develop a more flexible and open-minded mindset. You know, our institutions are often set up to have knowledge kind of very siloed in departments and classes. And you're giving them, presenting a variety of perspectives by definition when we do something interdisciplinary, and enable them to form connections between diverse forms of human knowledge. Skills, all right? You're going to teach them how to integrate between disciplines, sort of how to talk to one another and make it sort of mutually understandable, and how to apply knowledge across the board and how different skills can fit together. And that's going to really serve them well in life because life is complex. You all know that, and it's multidimensional, and basically it's multidisciplinary most of the time. So you're just preparing them for life. And the truth is that studies say that university administrators, employers like that. They like the skills that come out of an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary experience. Students can be more well-rounded, and that includes our STEM kids, who I can tell you, I've had many kids say, oh, I'm an engineer, I can't do this. Yes, you can. And it's great that they're confronting that and becoming more well-rounded. And believe me, I'm from 3 generations of electrical engineers. I have an electrical engineer's son and a physics daughter, so I'm not slamming the STEM students. Love them dearly. And then also just how to apply knowledge in a real world setting, which is actually what our course ended up doing. Educational experiences that are multidisciplinary for this reason can often feel kind of more authentic to students, like they can relate to it. And it seems to sort of anticipate what they will be doing in real life rather than having knowledge compartmentalized. Why else? It's fun, y'all. It's fun to do this, and that matters, right? We get excited in the classroom. Our students are engaged. It's often atypical for students. So you're going at something kind of sideways in a different way, and it's full of surprises for them. Personal reasons. Well, yeah, it's fun for us too, right? It's gratifying. It's exciting. I mean, it's interesting and creative, which I personally really enjoy. Novel source of inspiration for faculty. Definitely learn new ideas and applications because you're learning these from your colleagues. I had access to new opportunities. For example, I ended up giving a presentation at an archaeology conference, or a big archaeology conference. That wouldn't have been where I would normally have been presenting, and it was really fulfilling, all right, and picking up new skills. All right, so this is great. I'm telling you all this sort of theoretical stuff, but how do we actually do this? So there's several ways to offer an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary course. First of all, you can do it, one-stop shopping, all by yourself. And what you would do is use methodology from another discipline to achieve your goal. So, for example, I told you I'm a cultural historian. Cultural historians are trained in anthropological theory and using anthropological theory and models in our analysis of history. So, for example, you could do that and analyze values, identity, and belief in the United States Navy or United States Marine Corps. That is an application of cultural theory and models to a naval history topic. Similarly, in social history, let's say you want to look at, you decide, all right, in my classroom, I want to look at race or class or gender in the United States Navy or Marine Corps. Okay, you're now in the world of social history. And so you can read up on that and offer that and just be explicit with your students that that's what you're doing. All right, here's another way to do it. You can take a topic and you can go at it from multiple different angles. And in that case, you would unfortunately, that slide moved way over. I did it in Google Slides and it was converted to PowerPoint. So I'm sorry, something happened there, but I'll fill it in. So I gave you some possible things to think about. Let's say you want to do a seminar or something or a class on the post-Cold War order. And you could say, well, we're going to bring in political science. This is really messed up, so I'll translate. Political science, economics, and there you are. You're the military or naval historian down there. And the three together offering perspectives about the one shared idea. This one, I actually liked this idea. It's supposed to be who, and it's continued over here, who serves, which might be a really interesting way of looking at military service and who's actually participated in military service. In that case, you could bring in like a sociologist. You could bring in a political scientist or economist, and there you are, the historian as well, all right? Bringing in three different perspectives that would show students how we can go at it. And last or not least, it's down on the bottom, but that one was about, how did I put it, sort of an investigation of nuclear power, right? And so you could bring in a physicist or an engineer, a nuclear engineer, to talk about nuclear power. You could bring in sort of environmental scientist or a political scientist to talk about, say, nuclear energy. And yes, here comes the Navy in terms of nuclear propulsion and weapons, right? So those are all examples. All right, another approach. You can look at a complex topic that is shared. In order to sort of have a full grasp of that topic, you need to have participants from different disciplines. That was our shipwrecks course at USNA, right? You could not do that course without each discipline participating. You needed a historian, here I am. You needed an oceanographer, and you needed an ocean engineer in order to really do what we wanted to do with the course. If you do have maritime archaeologists on staff, of course, they're like going to be great at this, all right? So how can you actually do this? Here I gave you approaches. Institutionally, structurally, how do you make it work? United States Naval Academy does not make it easy to do this. I'll be honest with you. So we had to get creative. So first of all, you can offer your own independent course. You learn the material, you learn the approaches, and you share it with your students. So I gave you an example there. Maybe a social history topic using social theory or methods. Or you can offer your course and have guest lecturers who come in at different moments and present their perspective. All right, that puts you just a fully in charge independent course. You can team teach a shared course with a faculty member maybe taking an overload, or maybe your institution is generous enough to let that count as a course. It's very hard to do that at the Naval Academy. Typically, if we're going to team teach, one of us has to take an overload, all right? So that would be harder. But you can also cross-register a course between two departments. History wasn't really set up to do that. It turns out oceanography and ocean engineering were with SO 486. So when we offered this course, they offered a course that their students were allowed to cross-register for. And then I offered an independent history course, and then we collaborated across departmental lines unofficially, so to speak. So it looked like there were really three courses going, but this one was cross-registered. And then I'll show you sort of how we dealt with that. All right, so notice here's my description again. And I highlighted for you this time, the course is taught in coordination with two similar courses in oceanography and ocean engineering. And we ran those courses at the exact same time, Tuesday, Thursday, in the morning, all right? And that was by definition, because there's no rule that says we can't visit each other's classes and everything else, which is what we did. We collaborated in the overall vision of our courses. We had joint sessions at the beginning, in fact, at Rickover, right? I think we may have used this room at one point, and in Chauvenet, and at other key moments. For example, we had a case study about the SS Central America. I'll talk about that momentarily. And that was something that we collaborated on. And then we came together at the very end for the last month. We did everything together in a final project that integrated everything, and we put the midshipmen in teams, and they had to go out and find a shipwreck. Now, we were lucky because oceanography had access to a YP, one of the yard patrol boats that midshipmen train on. That's not going to be the case at every institution, but we took advantage of that feature. And what you needed the historians to be able to do the work with the primary sources to even begin to know where to look for a shipwreck. You needed the oceanographers to talk about things like drift, currents, wind conditions, because we're looking for a debris trail, and the ocean engineers to figure out how we're going to do our side scan sonar and what speed we should run and everything else. And so that's what we did at the end. The exams also included material from all the courses, and we had dedicated sessions where we rotated and we taught each other's classes. USNA didn't say we couldn't do that. All right, so finding the loopholes, right? All for a good reason. So my piece of it was obviously to teach about basically, why are shipwrecks where they are, and why do you have that type of shipwreck? Well, that's a history question. And also, how do you identify surviving documents and evidence that will help you ID the ship, help you find its location, and then, having to interpret, often very kind of deeply and creatively, those documents. All right, so that was my piece. This gives you an example. I taught the oceanography and ocean engineering students for a month, and this is what we did. I'm just sharing with you. You can see that I have what the lesson was. It was Tuesday, Thursday class, so I met with them twice a week. So what you're seeing here is like a week's worth of sort of lesson plan. And then it showed you how oceanography tied in and engineering. I was trying to make it easier for them, and this was the truth. This is what we were doing. And here we are again. Oceanography, that should say drift models in GIS, not GIF. I wasn't doing GIF files with them. And this is where we did this Central America case study. Now, I did a more elaborate job with that with my history students, and then they had an exam at the end. So the Central America, it's a really good example if you want to use something like this in your class, and it's very tragic. It's a huge shipwreck in 1857. There she is. She has a relationship to naval history because Captain Herndon was a naval officer. She's not a naval ship, but she was carrying the mail, and more importantly, she was carrying lots of gold from the California gold rush. And she went down in a hurricane off the coast of somewhere off the Carolinas, they knew, but it hadn't been able to find this very, very famous wreck. Between 450 and 500 people perished in that wreck. I think there were 587 people total, so there were some survivors. And they found it, all right? We had some folks who found it, and so we used that case study in class of how they found this wreck that had seemed impossible to discover, all right? And that was a great example of using primary sources to do that. Of course, for midshipmen, it has a personal connection because there's the Herndon Monument. Y'all have probably seen it in the yard or know about how the plebes have to scale it at the end of plebe year to mark the end of plebe year, all right? And that it commemorates the death of Captain Herndon. So it was a great case study for lots of reasons. Very relatable, accessible, and very creative use of primary sources to find that ship. Our unit at the end, what we did was tell them that there was this wreck. She's really out there. I got 5 minutes left. Okay, I'm not over though, right? No, I can do it. I got 5 minutes. I can do it. Hang on to your hat, folks. Here we go. So there's a little blurb from the New York Times. Basically, we turned them loose. They were in teams, and the history students would take the lead in this part. How do we find primary sources that are going to tell us where the Maxwell is? We just told them the Maxwell is sort of out there in the Chesapeake Bay, not far from us. It's up to you, because in real life, shipwreck discovery is very expensive. You have to have a very detailed search plan. And so they went looking for her. Then we worked with the oceanographers and the ocean engineering students, and they came up with search plans. If you look at number 4, that's actually where the Maxwell is on that chart on the right side. We actually were in the Annapolis Capitol, which is a local newspaper, for this class. So that's one of our midshipmen who was showing the Capitol reporter, what we were doing when we're out in the YP, going back and forth, kind of boring. And then it's so exciting because you find it with the sonar. And there it is. It lights up. It's very gratifying to see it. So these are images of the Maxwell. And I actually had, BJ says, I don't have a ton of time, but I looked at just randomly where people are coming from. So just some possible ideas, food for thought for your own institution. So someone here is from the Williamsburg Foundation. Well, my goodness, you've got those archaeologists at Yorktown National Battlefield, and you could do great things with the Battle of the Capes, Battle of the Chesapeake, working there. I've got one or more people from Texas A&M, okay, go Aggies, and there you've got a major research university with lots of different possibilities of people you could team up with. But you know, the med school has this really intriguing thing that you should check out. It's the Department of Humanities in medicine, and you could do something, for example, with epidemics and the military, or the history of the Navy Nurses Corps, which was founded in 1908, so that would be an interesting option. There's somebody here from Arkansas State. You have an interesting field of study called heritage studies. That sounds like someone you could collaborate with to, for example, study the image and perception of the military in American life, or look at how collective memory, monuments, memory, memorials, museums, naming things. That sounds like very rich, you know, a great opportunity for you down there. And Arkansas State also has this Delta Research Consortium that opens you up to collaborating with folks from other institutions. So I couldn't do everybody's institution, but show you, that's just food for thought. I've done it, I'm done, yay! I did it. I'm gonna hand this off, but this is great. The three presentations work really well together, I think. So.
All right, next up we have Dr. Nick Lambert, who was the class of 1957 chair here between 2016 and 2018. He began academic life as an economist, but was seduced by the dark side and became a historian. He is the author of 3 monographs, Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution, Planning Armageddon, British Economic Warfare in the First World War, and just last year, The Warlords and the Gallipoli Disaster, published by Oxford University Press.
Well, good morning. First thing, I do not have the energy of the previous speaker. And I'm pretty exhausted just by listening. But let's face it, I'm going to talk about some economics, which is not a subject that really lends itself to such an approach. You did? So, I wrote this, and then I've been having flashbacks all morning about what the midshipmen, particularly the plebes, used to ask me in their first or second class. Why do we have to be here? Why do we have to learn naval history? And some of my favorite midshipmen, they would literally be hunched up. You could see it written on their faces. Sometimes they actually tell you, why do I have to be here? Why do I have to learn this nonsense? And over the years that I was here, I came up with a number of answers. And the number one was really, history is a sandbox for studying complexity. It allows you to study case studies, to develop your understanding of just how complex things are. And understanding is absolutely critical. Before you can judge, before you can evaluate, before you can make a decision, it is essential that you understand the problem with which you're grappling. And understanding, of course, isn't at all the same thing as knowledge, and they often conflate the two. And of course, knowledge is the raw material, and yet there's a tension between the importance of possessing the knowledge and the fact that, of course, invariably you're going to make a decision with imperfect information. So there's a fundamentally antinomious relationship there. I don't use the word antinomious relationship when talking to plebes. And then the complexity, invariably they say, well, we deal with complex things. I mean, you should have been in my physics class yesterday. And I would say, yes, well, science can be complicated, but in a very different way. You press the button and nothing happens. Yes, and you have to deal with the human element, and I think John Gaddis has put it rather well. This is one of my favorite quotes. When I read through books, I often stick little flags in and use them many, many years later, which is why my bookshelf is twice as long as it really needs to be, because there's all the flags clog the place up. Anyway, it's getting into this question of it's a psychological element in decisions and systems and human motivation. And it's really only in history where you're dealing with this aspect of the problem. And let's face it, in any system that humans create, what is the bit that nearly always fails? It's the human element. How can you not study the human element? And yet, do you study the human element in science, in physics, in biology? Yes, sort of, but not really in quite in the same way, and not quite so explicitly. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing that I used to answer is, it actually helps you to develop worldview, your understanding of how the world works, how we comprehend the world, how it works. We talk about assumptions, which is based upon, well, I should say, rephrase it. When dealing with midshipmen, I found that you had to basically teach them assumptions of how the world really worked more than they were taught in or injected into them into high school, or they developed from Hollywood. And they really struggled initially. I mean, most of them understand that the world isn't really painted in black and white, it's shades of grey, but they don't quite appreciate how many shades of grey and how difficult it can be to determine whether it's this shade of grey or that shade of grey, and it really rather depends on your perspective. But worldview, it really is more important than even that, because it really frames your understanding of the worlds of yesterday and today and even tomorrow. It shapes your perceptions of what is important and what is unimportant, and it both relative and absolute terms. And it also influences not just how you see the world, I think, but where you look for evidence to answer the questions with which, or the problems with which you're grappling with, or quite often just to validate what you think is the answer. It channels directions and inquiry. And to give a very simple example, War of 1812, the classic question, who won the War of 1812? Well, the answer's obvious. But anyway, if you think of sea power so strictly in terms of combat, or which too many people do, then of course you look at the evaluation of the combat, and you turn to the relevant chapter in the textbook, and it says the score was 13-12, just like a football match. And well, there's your answer, isn't it? Very close, narrow game, but won by 1 point. But if you look at, let's say, the economic aspects to the War of 1812, and you look at the fact that the United States is pretty much bankrupt, they can't pay their soldiers, mass rates of desertion, they've got serious political problems, then the answer looks really, really rather different. It's the necessity. Sea power also includes this economic and commercial aspect, and we're going to talk about that a bit more today. How do you use this in the classroom, this concept of worldview in particular? Well, there's two ways. One is an incredibly boring methods, and you think economics is boring. I mean, how many people have done the graduate course on methods and I forget what do they call it? I couldn't even remember the title of it. It just switched me off. Historical, thank you. All those things, it's all a load of rubbish. Who cares? There's a much better way of doing it, which is, I should say, to my mind, there's a much better way of doing it. And there are books with these questions embedded within them. And one of the most effective ways of introducing people to worldview is to read the books of a particular historian that I'm thinking of, who actually it's woven into his narratives. So he tells an intrinsically interesting story, but he also deals with this issue of worldview at the same time. And the funny thing is, the person I'm thinking of, the historian, was actually a former naval officer. And he became one of the most important and influential historians of the 20th century. And he was United States Academy, class of 1944, served at Okinawa, invalided out of the Navy. How many people know who I'm talking about here? Well, of course you know, because we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. There we go. William Appleman Williams, United States Naval Academy, class of 44. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And nobody knows about him. You know, and it's you know, he has a how to put it? He has a very economic-orientated perspective on how the world works. You know, it's for him, economics is foundational. It's foundational to the study of human motivation and human activity. He also believed clearly that we lived in the fundamental condition of human existence is scarcity. Yep. He was, not many people know this, he was a very keen and knowledgeable student on naval history, and yet he didn't write any books on naval history. And why is that? Let's just say, and I'll just touch upon it and then I'll move on forward, but no, William Appleton Williams is not remembered very fondly by the United States Navy. And if truth be told, he was treated extremely badly by them, particularly by the United States Naval War College. And there were consequences, I believe, long-term consequences for this, which maybe we will talk about towards the end. You know, he's dismissed as a socialist, Marxist, and best yet, an economic determinist. I love being called an economic determinist because it means the person doesn't have any clue about the subject. And I'm thinking, right, if this had more time, I would talk about the Monty Python scene about the holy hand grenade of Antioch. That's exactly the image that it gets conjured up whenever I hear someone accused of being an economic determinist. Anyway, so I love the phrase. Anyway, so let's much more move over to talking about other people and their worldviews and relate it much more closely to naval history. So I have here 2 books published in 1890. The first one, of course, influenced Seapower upon history. Yeah, we all know Alfred Thayer Mahan. Needs no introduction, really. He is the master of sea power. Yeah? In terms of breadth and sophistication of his thinking on the subject, nobody else has ever come close. The second man, Principles of Economics, is Alfred Marshall. How many people know of Alfred Marshall? Yes, but an economist, right? There you are. We'll console each other later. Anyway, he is very similar. He is you know, what Mahan is to sea power, Marshall is to economics. Absolutely foundational figure in so many aspects. And I'm not going to bore you with telling me how. He's the professor of economics at Cambridge University. Published in the same year. You know, it runs to, I think he even outsells Mahan. It's foundational textbook that lasts 60, 70 years, just like Mahan. Quite an extraordinary thing. Anyway, there's a broader point to be made here. Is their worldview is incredibly similar. I'm going to show you the first page of, this is Mahan's Influence of Sea Power upon History, page 1, paragraph 1. And I'm not going to read it out to you because I'm tired. And, but you can see, just very quick, I need to read it better, I think. There is an enormous amount of economics in here. Yeah. And he thought this was sufficiently important that he's front-end loading his book with this. I mean, it's quite clear, yes? History of sea power, yes? Culminates in war. The profound, it's sea commerce, it's the wealth and strength of nations, yes? Principles. Now I'm going to quickly show you the next one, which is Alfred Marshall. This is his first paragraph. I broke it into 2 because it's just easier to read that way. Very similar. I think it's extraordinary. I mean, I don't know how many people see what I see in this. Hopefully more than one. And then I'll just put them shoulder to shoulder, as it were, while I say a few things. So bearing in mind that these 2 authors are writing on very different subjects, I think there's an extraordinary similarity in their worldviews. Needless to say, you know, the evidence, what I'm saying here, it consists of a little bit more than just these opening paragraphs. I mean, it's threaded. It's the core, one of the core messages throughout both books. Yep. And not just these books, but all their works. And what I find fascinating is that Marshall and Mahan basically agree that at all times, economic considerations are the primary driver of human behavior. I think it's pretty unmistakable. And they both talk about the importance of wealth generation. Alfred Marshall used to, well, he had multiple definitions of what economics was, but one of them was, one of his favorite, was he used to call it the science of wealth generation. They both can agree on something else. Economic issues, the chief sources of human friction that lead to conflict and wars. Now, maybe Marshall says it only implicitly, but remember, this isn't his subject, war, yes? But Mahan, he's quite explicit on that, isn't he? He's crystal clear, yeah? And he doesn't just assert this, but he actually provides a logic to go with it. And it's basically, to follow this, is that you have to recognize that power, not war, is the primary subject of his book. He's not talking about the sea, he's talking about power. That's the operative word in Seapower. And his core thesis is the pursuit of power basically revolves around the question of wealth, because powerful states invariably are wealthy nations. And the single most invaluable engine of wealth generation in modern history, especially, has been international trade. And his explanation for this is very simple, and again, I'm not going to dwell upon this, but he says repeatedly in his books, it is always easier and cheaper to move goods by sea. It's as simple as that. Its costs are cheaper by sea. He also makes the point that taxes on trade have also been the single most important source of state revenues up until the 20th century. And then he addresses that in his later work too. If you read on with Influence Sea Power upon History, it's all about the interplay between the factors of trade, wealth, and power, and the interrelationship between them. And for Mahan, it's he's dismissed somebody as generally, he's opposed to commerce warfare. He's opposed to Goethe course. Yes, he's opposed to Goethe course, but he had a very specific meaning for that. For him, Goethe course was unsystematic attack on trade. That's what he objected to, it being unsystematic. He wanted to be systematic. And for Mahan, again, it's the ability to manipulate or control the flows of trade through the global trading system. That's what gives states the leverage for power. And that potentially can produce strategically decisive results. And this is what he talks about what he means when he talks about the noiseless pressure of sea power. And that, in a nutshell, is why navies exist for Mahan. So we'll circle back around and some of the implications of this question of worldview. And we're going to slightly deeper waters here, I suppose. Worldview, to my way of thinking, is absolutely essential to developing strategic perspective. And it is fairly notorious, I think, today, that the Navy does not do strategy very well. Funnily enough, the US Marine Corps does it far better. It's one of the mysteries of the universe. But in both cases, there is this persistent tendency to conflate ends and means, strategy and operations. How many times can you talk to people about strategy? And invariably, they start talking about operations. Yeah. And if strategy is the application of military means to achieve political ends, then for any action to qualify as strategic, yes, then it must clearly connect to the attainment of some political object. Otherwise, it's just operations. And this is what Mahan is talking about. He saw this problem. He grappled with it. It drove him up the wall. He used to say this again and again and again. Yes, he's talking about the frigate actions in the War of 1812. And he made himself incredibly unpopular with the Navy, because up until when he was writing, he said this repeatedly. I think this quote comes from 1897, 1898. But he was saying it right up to his death. How unpopular? What is the greatest achievement of the United States Navy up to about up until 1942? Let's face it. It was the frigate actions. And here he's saying they don't really count for very much in the greater scheme of things. That didn't make him very popular. All right, well, I've made that point. Now, but one last question. So how do you actually inject some economics into, how do you infuse more economics into naval history? Oh, you like the title? Well, this is the West Point Atlas. It's a great map. It tells you so much. The only criticism I have, it doesn't make the rivers sufficiently clear. But ask yourself the question, where are all the amphibious attacks by the United States Navy during the Civil War? Where's the first one? Hatteras. What are you aiming to close? And you burn. It's the terminals. That's what they're hitting. This is where this bit's more important, the river. You look at, what's the most significant, on land, what's the most significant battle in the Civil War in 1861? First Bull Run, yeah, we know that. But in 1862, what's the most significant engagement or battle? Shiloh. Shiloh. Where is Shiloh? Right there. What is right there? It's pretty clear, right? And then Vicksburg, which is the most significant campaign of 1863? Vicksburg. Yeah? Point made. And that's the only complaint I have about this. It doesn't show how far up into Tennessee the river goes. You can see where the advance stops because they can't transport the stream. So, economic. Now, do I need to belabor the point or point being made? Why does this exist? This determines so much of the strategy by the United States Navy. And what is the governing consideration? It's the logistics. You can call it logistics. But why are these railways, do these railways exist here for the purposes of the Navy in anticipation of there being a civil? No, there are economic considerations that govern all of this. So, I suppose I'm probably just about at time. So I'm not going to say that economics explains absolutely everything about naval history, but they're very close interrelationships. And at the very least, I would say it is a safe point of departure for understanding what navies do and how to think of navies and how to think in terms of strategy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, our last speaker is Dr. Bill Trimble, Professor Emeritus at Auburn University in Alabama. His most recent book is Admiral John S. McCain and the Triumph of Naval Air Power. He is also the author of Wings for the Navy, A History of the Naval Aircraft Factory, Admiral William A. Moffett, Architect of Naval Aviation, Jerome C. Hunsaker and the Rise of American Aeronautics, Attack from the Sea, A History of the U.S. Navy's Seaplane Striking Force, and Hero of the Air, Glenn Curtiss and the Birth of Naval Aviation, among other books and articles. In 2011, he won the Admiral Arthur W. Radford Award for Excellence in Naval Aviation History and Literature from the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation, and in 2014 to 2015, he was a visiting professor here at the Naval Academy as the Class of 1957 Chair in Naval History and Heritage. Without further ado.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. This is the changer, right?
That's right.
And just hit that?
And just hit the trigger.
Just tap. Okay. Thank you very much, Bob, and thank all of you, especially BJ, Chris, all of you guys. I don't need too many excuses to get to Annapolis, so this is just a wonderful experience. Also, my wife says, "Why are you here? You're just an old guy. They're not going to care about, what you have to say. Why are they inviting an old guy like you here?" And I go, "I don't know. It's just the way it seems to be." I'm going to talk about three courses that I've taught. The first one is World Naval History. The second one I've taught, which was at Auburn University. The second one I taught was here, the History of Naval Aviation, which I also tried to be as much global as possible. And then I also did HH 104 for 2 semesters of that, but I'm not going to talk very much about that right at the end. Right up front here, you can see 2 ships, bookending technology at sea. On the left is a reproduction of Queen Hatshepsut's ship that was used as part of a fleet that she took down the Red Sea to the land of Punt in the 15th century BC. And one of the aspects of this that really stands out and is crucial is that here was the use of the sail. The Egyptians pioneered sailing, and they did it primarily because of the way the Nile flowed. The Nile flowed from south to north. The wind blew primarily from the northwest. So you could flow with the current from south to north, but if you had a sail, you could use the wind and the wind power to go against the current to the south. And once you were able to do that, you could go anywhere on the planet. So the Egyptians really stood out as being pioneers on what Lionel Casson calls an epic-making idea and an epic-making invention. One other thing about this is a reproduction or a replica of her ship. And also, remember that we're talking about women here and being inclusive as much as possible. She was a pharaoh. It had some teething problems. And I know about this from a really superb Nova series on PBS about this reproduction. They assumed that if you put the planks together and laced them together, it wasn't nailed and it wasn't held together any other way. They assumed that once you got it in the water, the wood would swell up and it wouldn't leak anymore. Guess what? Got it in the water, sank immediately. So wait a minute, we've got to rethink this a little bit and maybe get a little bit of caulking in here. And when they found out we were able to do that and make the thing actually float, it sailed really well. On the right-hand side, you can probably guess what this is the Gerald Ford. That ship had some teething problems too, and probably still has some teething problems because before it becomes fully operational. So here you can see you can bookend those two aspects of technology. One of the things here that I really tried to stress as much as possible in the World Naval History course was to make it as global as I could. The idea here too, I taught this from 2006 to 2016. The idea here too was to make it parallel to and complementary to the world history courses that we specialized in at Auburn. All freshmen in one way or another at Auburn have to take either world history or what I taught, technology and civilization, which was also a world history course specializing and emphasizing technology. So I said, we're gonna make this thing as global as possible, which meant I had to put a lot of work into this, and I knew some aspects of this, specific aspects of naval history and naval aviation history, but boy, I sure didn't know it on a global basis. The other thing I emphasize as much as possible, and I think all of you guys do this too. Oh, and by the way, from Auburn, I always emphasize when I'm talking to students, I refer to them as you guys. I have not ever been able to get into you all. I just could not, I just could never handle. I even had some of my colleagues would refer to you all, and I go, or all of you all, and I'm going, I'm not going there. And people have mentioned this too. Maybe Nick mentioned this or somebody else mentioned this. We're not talking about people who are going to become historians, for the most part. We're talking about students who are going to go on to all kinds of occupations and go on to all kinds of things that they're going to do. So you don't want to think about these courses as anything other than, and I try to emphasize this as much as possible, an extended case study. And some of the other people have talked about that as well and how important that is. What we're dealing here is assessing, analyzing, developing facts. And in this day and age, right now, in the political atmosphere we're in, facts are really pretty important, and not alternative facts, real facts. And then using and analyzing those facts to solve problems, and using history as a way of doing that. Here are real people who had to come up with situations, or found themselves in situations, where they had to do problem solving. And they might not have had all the information they wanted to have either, and come up with solutions. And not only that, you're going to have to articulate why you got to that solution. And I try to emphasize as much as possible in classes, you're going to have to articulate that in person, in class, in classroom discussions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And you're also going to have to write something. And depending on the course, and this course I didn't have them write quite as much as I did in, say, my history of naval aviation, which was a more advanced course, and I had them write more in that. So you've got to do two things here. You've got to analyze the facts, you've got to look at the facts, you've got to put them together, and then articulate solutions to those. I tried to make these courses as much as I could comprehensive and inclusive. And it's pretty tough. When you're dealing with naval history, world naval history, American naval history, or naval aviation history, guess what? It's about a lot of dead white people. You really have to dig deep and go the extra mile to make it as inclusive as possible. And I tried, and the more I would teach it, you come up with more information that you find out about women and about minorities, African Americans, people of color. You find more of that, work it in as much as possible. And again, try to keep it as global as possible. Of course, what's involved with this in world naval history is this concept of the oceans as the great common, and sea power, as you all know, as a way of controlling maintaining control, gaining control of that great common, and denying it to adversaries. And one of the things that Nick said was, hey, look, how much bulk cargo, how much bulk stuff goes from one place to another on this planet? About 90% of the weight of that stuff is going by the oceans. It's not going by air, and it's not going by land. It's pretty expensive to do it any other way. So I try to do that as much as possible. In world naval history, start off with the Egyptians, and what they were doing is really the world's first seafarers, carrying that through into the Mediterranean as much as possible. They went out into the Mediterranean. Then moving on especially to Athens, the first great maritime empire, if you will, and then the clash between the Greeks and the Persians representing in some ways here a continental power as much as possible, the Athenians or the Greeks representing a maritime power. And that can set you up very nicely for understanding the differences, the similarities, and the contrast between a primarily continental power and a primarily maritime power. And there you can get into all kinds of political, social, and cultural things as well. I'm going to go forward for this pretty quickly. Rome, you think of primarily as a land power to a certain extent, but the Mediterranean. That was the Roman Sea. That was Mare Nostrum. And here the Romans used sea power to extend many aspects of their conquest and their land power, and to provide the logistics that was so central for that. Deal with the Byzantine Empire, deal with aspects of the development of maritime enterprises in the Arab and the Muslim world and conflicts there, especially in the Mediterranean. Eventually the emergence of Venice being extraordinarily important here during the Renaissance period, and establishing another maritime empire, deal a great deal with that to a considerable extent. Elements of the emergence of the English Navy, the Tudor Navy, and then ultimately the clash with Spain, and you all know about the Spanish Armada. There's some interesting things you could do with that, and I tried to do that as much as possible as far as leadership was concerned. The Marquis de Santa Cruz was really the premier Spanish naval commander. He clashed with the Portuguese in the Azores, some of the first, maybe the first, open ocean battles that were fought. He was a genius. What happened was he contracted typhoid fever and died. And his mantle then, his command, passed on to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who was not the same kind of commander, who was not the same kind of person to take command of the Armada as well as Santa Cruz did. What happened? What if Santa Cruz had lived and was able to command the Armada during that campaign in 1588? It might have turned out very differently. Other aspects of that moving forward into the more modern era are especially important with the emergence of Britain, the Royal Navy, and the establishment of the empire, and of course the colonial wars that were fought through the American Revolution and on into the real conflict between maritime conflict, especially between Britain and France. And I usually put this down as Nelson versus Napoleon. So here again you deal with that in terms of continental powers versus maritime powers. Continuing on through that into the world wars, a lot that you can do with the world wars, especially you're all familiar with that from the courses that you've taught. One of the things that I emphasize here is that it's passing the baton, if you will, World War II in particular, passing the baton from the Royal Navy to the United States Navy, and what happened there in particular. And in looking at the strategies and looking at going into World War II, if you look at what the British had available to them, were they ever able to basically fight a three-front war in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and to a certain extent in the Pacific, and come out of that successfully? Well, they came out of successfully, but impoverished basically, and that then turned the baton over to the United States especially. So dealing with that, and then into the post-war era, as much as I tried to deal with this globally, I ran into some problems in terms of what's available. So what I had to do was to get things online, bring things in from articles, to be able to deal with, for example, China, to be able to deal with India, to be able to deal with the developing world as much as possible. And some of the readings became more problematic by the time we got toward the end of the course. As far as style is concerned, or pedagogy, I really emphasize lecture and discussion as much as I possibly can. And the lectures can be different. For this course, I would maybe have a beginning lecture on, say, Monday, or if it was going to be a Tuesday, Thursday class on Tuesday, and then carry forward with the discussions after that. Some of these other courses that I've taught, I would maybe start off with a mini lecture summarizing what we're going to do that day, or maybe even what we're going to do later on that week, and then hand it over to students for discussion as much as possible. Now, what that means is that there are a lot of responsibility that students have to read the material. And how do you get, we've talked about this also, how do you get students to read this stuff? And in fact, if you ask them, they'll say, have you read this stuff? And they'll say, no, I haven't read it. The way I do it is, you've got to have discussion quizzes. You have to have quizzes, and I would have them every other week based on the readings. And essentially what you would have would be 8 names and terms. You write on 5 of those, tell me what they are, identify them, and indicate the significance of them. And I kept it simple, 5 points on each of them. If you identify it correctly, you get 2 points. That's the easy part. If you want to get the significance of that, you get the other 3 points. Usually everybody's going to get those 2 points. They're going to struggle with the 3. Now sometimes you get a weird thing where they know the significance of it and they have no idea what the thing was. But that doesn't usually happen. And especially here I've used study guides. I'll give them a long list of names and terms specifically coming from each of the readings, so they know exactly what's going to be coming up on that reading quiz. I would usually do 2-hour exams and a final exam. That would also include another reading quiz at the beginning of that, and then a couple of questions, essay questions, where they would write on one of those 2. They get a choice there as well. And a study guide, in some cases the study guides before those essay questions almost tell them what the questions are going to be. I use big general terms that they can bring together, you can consolidate them, sometimes even just going ahead and giving them, say, 8 questions beforehand. So the important point here that I'm trying to make is you don't want to surprise any students with anything. Don't put anything out there that they're not going to be thoroughly prepared for. Problems with the readings, especially the books. For this course, I used Ken Hagen's History of the United States Navy, this People's Navy, which was really good because it's provocative. And he's making a point that the United States Navy reflects the people and the democracy of this country, and maybe you don't need to have big battle fleets. I also used a book by Arthur Herman on the Royal Navy, which was not quite as good. If there's a better one out there, I would certainly like to know about it. And then I also brought Japan in, and a very good book by David Evans and Mark Peaty called Kaigun. And it's big, it's complicated, but boy, it is a fabulous book. And it really brings forward the complexity of the Japanese Navy. Papers, a research paper. I try to emphasize as much as possible primary sources, secondary sources, bring them together. I provide a list of where you can get them. Lots of stuff online, lots of stuff published, primary sources that they can use. Generally keep this pretty short. History of naval aviation. Oops, sorry, I hit it twice, didn't I? Want to back me up quickly? I don't want to keep us from lunch either. On the left side, this is the history of naval aviation that I taught here at the Academy. On the left side is Eugene Ely flying off the Birmingham in Hampton Roads in November of 1910. And on the right-hand side is an Indian aircraft carrier named Vikramaditya. Don't ask me how to spell that. I'm not even sure I know how to pronounce it. And again, I tried to make this as global as possible. Of course, I could have had an American aircraft carrier there as well. Again, trying to make this global as possible, as inclusive as possible, but guess what? It boiled down to the United States, Britain, and Japan for the most part. And again, toward the end of the course, I tried to get enough other readings in that they can get some aspect of what was going on with naval aviation in the developing world, China, Japan as well. For a long time, Brazil was also operating an aircraft carrier as well. This is heavy on technology. It has to be. So there was a lot of emphasis here on technological change, how that took place. It's not linear. It's not predetermined. I sometimes use the example of the rigid airship in the Navy. It wasn't predetermined that that was going to be a dead end. What was the Navy trying to do here, the United States Navy trying to do here in the 20s and 30s? They're limited in terms of the cruisers that they have. They're limited in terms of what their fleets are. Why not use a rigid airship with the range and endurance that it has, sometimes even with a heavier than air unit on board, to be able to provide the scouting that the Navy needs? It wasn't a predetermined dead end as far as technology was concerned. And a lot of diffusion, a lot of movement of technology back and forth, and technological transfer that I used as well in this course. And that seemed to work pretty well. A lot on the interwar period. What's going on here in the interwar periods? That's what's happening that's going to determine, if you will, what the first years of the next war are going to be like. So I put a lot of emphasis here on some of the interwar developments. We've talked here about the Washington naval treaties. One of the things I also like to do in these discussion classes is make a list. Here are some problems. Here are some things you need to deal with. Let's make some points on one side of this. Let's say here are alliances on one side. Here are the alliances on the other side. And start making these lists. Before you know it, you're filling up a blackboard or you're filling up a whiteboard as students discuss this. And one of the things I really like to do in this course was to look at the Washington Treaty in terms of what was going on as far as naval aviation was concerned, aircraft carriers. The United States and Britain were allowed 135,000 tons of aircraft carriers. Japan had 81,000 tons. You couldn't have an aircraft carrier larger than 27,000 tons. All right, here's your situation, and I've done a biography of William Moffett. This is what William Moffett had to deal with. I've got a limited tonnage here. I want to get the maximum number of platforms as I can. I'm also limited because I've got two large aircraft carriers here that are taking up 66,000 tons of my 135,000 tons. So here, students, is the problem. You've got 135,000 tons to deal with. You're limited to 27,000 tons. You want to get the maximum platforms, and they almost always come up with the right solution. That ultimately you're going to have this mix of aircraft carriers that are going to be the first aircraft carriers, or the aircraft carriers that are going to fight the first 2 years maybe of World War II. And it's really a lot of fun to do that. Again, I emphasize lecture and discussion here as much as possible, the back and forth within the course. Readings were a problem, and I'm not even sure where to go now with the readings. I used Richard Knott's Illustrated History of Naval Aviation. I used, which I don't think is in print anymore. I don't know, it certainly would need to be updated. I also used a book by David Ragg on British naval aviation, which I thought was pretty disappointing. But Mark Petey's book, Sunburst, is fabulous on Japan and Japanese naval aviation. Pretty much the same pattern here. Reading quizzes, get the people to read as much as possible. The exams, essay exams, and a mix of IDs on those as well. And then a more extended paper in this course, using, again, a mix of primary and secondary sources. Lots of stuff online, lots of stuff right here at the Naval Academy. You can even go to Washington if you want. And then finally, I taught the HH 104 course for 2 semesters. I'm going to be done. Some of you are familiar with this. You've taught it. You know all about it. We tried to make it as inclusive also as we possibly could. It was also very collaborative. We would get together at least once a week and talk about what we're going to do that week. We collaborated on exams as much as we possibly could to make sure we had consistency across the board. And one last point I want to make. I always would start this off, and I said, all right, here is the first United States Navy commissioned ship, Alfred, at Philadelphia in 1776. Why on earth does the Navy not have a ship named the Alfred? We got the Ronald Reagan, we got all these other, we need to have a ship named the Alfred, and it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. Thank you very much.
We'll do the Q&A if you want to stay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll get our Q&A session started. So once again, you can just raise your hand. I'll pick the question, and then if the panelists, you can take them in whatever order. And if you could repeat the question for our YouTube watchers, that would be great. So, questions? Go ahead.
Professor Lambert, I think it's fascinating that those two books came out in the same year. So I have a question on context. What is going on in the 1880s? What's in the air that's produced to which those two books come out at the same time? And is that something that did you talk with students about that? Did you talk about the contextual reasons? Like why
I think it's just coincidence myself.
We need this for the video.
Oh, I mean, you can talk at length about the professionalization of the emergence of history as a discipline. You've got the emergence of economics as a discipline. Economics, of course, and I mean, I don't know how much. Psychology used to be part of the School of Economics up until about late 1890s, early 1900s. It was split off. And so economics separated out from psychology, and then they don't come back together again until the 50s, 60s, or 70s when you start getting behavioral economics. Anyway, I could go on and on and on. So those sorts of subjects. But I mean, so yes, but why 1890? I don't think it's anything more than coincidence. I wish I could have some more profound answer. Don't have one.
Other questions? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, Dave Winkler. I did a review recently in naval history for Paul Kennedy's Victory at Sea, and I liked the take he had on comparing basically six navies in the 1936 time frame, and then what happens a decade later, and why is one on top, and it's a lot of it deals with it's economics stupid. It's any comment is a possibility incorporating that into we may not have had the opportunity to look at it yet, but as far as the type of course you're talking about.
You mean specifically what happened in World War II that led ultimately to British and American victory, Allied victory, but the bigger Navy coming out of this is going to be the United States Navy.
Yeah.
Well, it's simply, how can I put this? It is economics. There is no way that the British were going to be able to provide that kind of a fleet with that kind of money, those kind of resources. It's amazing what they were able to do. They obviously had a lot of help from the Canadians, from the Australians, everybody else, and within the Commonwealth or within the Empire. But the writing was on the wall. Anybody would look at that objectively. I guess Churchill probably didn't, seeming that you could keep the empire going forever. No way. It just seemed I would think there's some determinism involved with that, especially. But the way, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the way the British look at this is that we're just an extension of what they tried to do. One of the things I didn't talk about in the Herman book was that he makes a point that here was the Royal Navy extending some of these aspects of British culture, English culture, economics, capitalism throughout the world. You can get some really interesting discussions there because you can make a pretty good argument that the British Empire was the worst thing that ever happened to the world. And we're still living with the consequences of that. So you can get all kinds of discussions there in that transition especially. Nick might be able to add more.
You're forgetting the French.
Oh, and the French.
Short answer is...
I forgot the Dutch.
First requirement for any Navy is what? Money. And the last requirement too. You can't have a Navy without money. You can't get the money unless you're able to tax something. You can't tax something unless the wealth exists. And the second thing to bear in mind is that whenever you're trying to extract money from a particular society, you've got to always remember you're in competition with other interest groups, are you not? That seems to be something the US Navy today there's a sense of entitlement, I think, in the United States Navy to have access to the money. But their first requirement is to basically provide a coherent rationale of why they should be given the money to begin with, let alone why they should be trusted with it. And that's something they need to work on a bit.
I'll just add a PS, and that is to, as put on my Dutch, my historian of the Dutch Republic right here, is if you want to do economic history and naval history combined, the Dutch are really the first. It's very easy to go to the British Empire, but the 17th century, which is when you really have this period of expansion, and is all about the Dutch Navy. And they're fascinating to study. They're like eating their Wheaties for the entire century. And there's very important developments that happened in that period in terms of naval architecture, in terms of gunnery, in terms of tactics. And so it's great. They're really the first, world historians say, the first hegemonic power in world history. It would be the Dutch Republic, and then the British Empire, and then the age of the United States. So they're a wonderful example if you want to look at case studies of economics and naval power. So don't forget about the Dutch. Okay.
Can I add one thing about the Dutch?
Yes.
In both Tech and Civ and in World Naval History, I mentioned the Voigt, and you had that up on
Yeah.
your slide.
Yeah.
And I referred to that as the DC-3 of the 17th century because it could make money.
Right.
It had the manning,
Yep.
and minimal manning.
Minimal manning. Maximum cargo space. Yeah.
Just the kind of rig that you needed to be able to operate economically, and they're very much part of the Dutch
Yeah. And
economic empire.
they're fascinating in terms of if you really want to work. I mean, I'm not just doing a cheap sell of the Dutch here. They really are. They're very interesting, and they're kind of accessible and relatable for students because it's a Dutch republic. It's not an absolutist monarchy, and they have amazing. They invent newspapers, for example. There's an amazing kind of paper trail for all of this, and they have a visual culture that's fantastic. So yeah, the Flout is revolutionized the carrying trade because they were also the masters of the carrying trade. They're also the most prolific shipbuilders at the time, and everyone else is buying from them. They create all these financial markets, okay, stock markets, futures, and commodities trading, insurance, etc. So yeah, they're a great example.
How big was the VOC?
Yeah, that's the Dutch East India Company, and that is they're really interesting to use with students too, or the trade companies, because it's like you have McDonald's and Burger King, but they're armed and they're fighting each other. Or Coke and Pepsi, and it gets like really nasty. But you have really important, it's interesting because they're practically sovereign in their power. They have their own navies and their own military forces and Marines, and which they actually use the word Marine in Dutch. So yeah, they're an amazing example. And if you read Dutch, which I don't assume most people can, but the archives are amazing for the VOC. And the West India Company is interesting as well. So yeah, they're another, if you want to do like a survey of connections between naval power and economic power, please don't forget the Dutch, because they're awesome.
No, I'll absolutely echo that. Just from my own experience, students tend to be very interested in the Dutch and in just economic history in general. Fun experiment. Ask your students how many of them own crypto. I think you'll be surprised by the answer. I think I saw a question here. Go ahead.
The oceanography course.
Yes.
That you discussed. I wanted to bring up a variation on that, which I participated in once, which was we had a historian and some shipwreck finders, oceanography
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah.
And they, when they had film or evidence from a wreck, this was World War II wrecks, we looked at the after-action reports and the primary source descriptions of the sinkings, of the battle and the sinkings. And then we would come up with, all right, this is what we think happened.
Yeah.
to basically look at a complicated thing and then have people discuss it from different angles.
Yeah, I echo what you're saying completely. I think students can forget that artifacts are primary sources, first of all. So a wreck site is a primary source. It's an incredibly rich primary source. And if you do naval history, they're crucially important, actually, because it confirms interpretations or doesn't confirm interpretations that we might have of our primary sources. And yeah, they're very kind of, I don't know, mysterious and engaging for students. The way we set up the shipwrecks course is we could do it, you can kind of do it two ways. You can start with the wreck and you can decipher it. You can interpret it because it's a very rich primary source. And we did that in class, okay, because I taught you all talk about case studies. That was essentially how that course was taught. In a lot of my courses, I do case studies. Or you can start with what we had them do with the Maxwell at the end. Start with the primary sources, because that's what any maritime archaeology search has to do. It's very, very costly to go out there, and the sea is vast. It's not easy to find these things. You can know where something is approximately. That's the problem with the Bonhomme Richard wreck from the Battle of Flamborough Head. We more or less know where it should be, and it's just not popping up. And so you have to start with the primary sources, interpret them closely, and then plug in the oceanographic phenomena, like what are the currents, what is the oxygen level like, are we, how deep could it be? And that's going to affect if you can find it. And then you have to plug in the ocean engineering aspect about what kind of sonar are you using, and so how do you make a search a plan for that. So it's very inviting. So I encourage anybody who can find a way to do that. It's shipwrecks and that sort of thing is a really good way to get a lot of students, I think, engaged.
Like you said, the sonar images they just attract the eye. They can make them so colorful, and the wreck itself is just so fascinating.
It takes something that's abstract, that there's this wreck there, and then all of a sudden you see proof of it, and it's like a ghost, right? I mean, that's part of, I always tell students, I encourage them as much as possible, actually, if you can go to the archive, I know we're all busy, and the internet's great, like how much is available, but if you can actually go up to like special collections, I'll make a plug for USNA special collections right here, they're wonderful, and it's like you can feel the ghosts with you as you read these things, right? And I think it's the same when you have, like, all of a sudden, I would see with the midshipmen, you're trolling the sonar, nothing, and then all of a sudden, here, they're like, it worked. The search plan worked. They're so excited. And yeah, there's something about it that's inviting. So.
A question over there, Jennifer.
Yeah, this follows up on that question, and it's like a comment, a question, and an offer. So I'm a maritime archaeologist. So
Yay!
You're very welcome.
Yes.
I teach at East Carolina University in program in maritime studies, which is interdisciplinary.
Right. I know you're for, yeah.
Yeah, so my sort of comment is I love that you're focused on interdisciplinary and finding the loopholes, and I think that mindset of interdisciplinary helps you find the loopholes. It's the same sort of way that your mind kind of intersects things. And so the loophole is whether or not, is there another loophole to partner with other institutions like ECU? And the offer is, if you ever teach this class again, would you be interested in, partnering, because I can give lectures, or, this goes for other people that are in the room that are interested in, archaeology, shipwrecks, maritime archaeology, whether or not, you would want to partner on something, because we could give joint lectures and involve students in, civilian universities with students who are in military.
I'm always, see, this is what I was talking about when I had my image up there and it says opportunities. If you're that's like a really cool opportunity. Yeah, I would. I haven't been able to teach a shipwrecks course because my two colleagues retired. And the history department doesn't have access to a YP, which is the yard patrol boat. So we can't, the search was so fun and you can't do that. So if there's a way to, especially now that one of the silver linings of the pandemic was we can actually use these sort of virtual means of collaborating that we hadn't before. And I dare say we all gotten a lot more comfortable with that. So yes, we can certainly talk. That would be great. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Denise, you can go ahead.
So Denise, Naval History and Heritage Man, but this is more wearing my former maritime administration hat. I'm struck by what I view as something that's missing in the conversation. So in the prior panel, we were talking about logistics. And I've been hearing a lot about the Navy, and I hear about ships, and I hear about sailors. But I'm not hearing anything about the merchant marine. And I'm curious if the story of the merchant marine is being told. Because in order to be successful in war, or at least last century, the merchant marine was needed. And so I'm curious, is the story of the merchant marine being told? And the other question is it being told in a way that could overlap with what's going on at Kings Point and the 6 state maritime schools? Because what you're teaching here overlaps with them, because they, at least the students there are required to go into the military. So how do you create an overlap so we get a more fuller picture of what happened?
I'll give my answer and I can pass it so they can respond. I mean, I consider myself like a maritime historian. I mean, I do naval history as part of that, but even when I was giving my remarks on the Dutch, you know, we're talking about the trade company and merchant sailing, and that's the foundation. I mean, that's really the justification. You talked about the Armada, 1588, and you know that's the reason that Portugal is the first naval power. Is it has to do with their merchant trade. So I know well, and I do piracy, so that's all about and privateering. You know, guerre de course, and so that's about the interruption of that. And we talked about 90% of the world's goods, you know, like I tell midshipmen, like when you order something from Amazon, it didn't just sort of like instantly materialize. It's probably moved through the maritime domain, like 90% of the world's goods. So I think a lot of us actually are including that. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I'm betting economics you do. But I don't know.
I don't even know how to begin to answer that question. It's such a huge question. And a subject. I mean, we talk about this for hours. I mean, your remarks earlier, I thought I couldn't agree more about the problem with the Sea Lift Command, and the fact is, the assumption that the logistics are there when transparently they're not. Absolutely. Related to that, it just popped into my mind is that I think one of the most extraordinary lessons in sea power in recent times actually has occurred over the last 6 months. It's being delivered by the Russians, and nobody is seeing it that way, which is extraordinary. I mean, with grain and with particularly with the grain. I mean, they're able to wreck the international economy, creating levels of problem. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on about it. I mean, all this talk about the Ukrainian wheat starting to move, and is it? No. Why not? Because there's no war risks insurance. Again, we could talk for hours on that. So, happy to. I mean, as I say, we could talk. So I agree with this. And is it? And I have some suggestions as to why it isn't discussed. But that probably is a subject for another day.
I totally agree with my colleagues. One of the problems you run into in these courses, these survey courses especially, is you only have so much time. You figure I have 15 weeks and you can go through everything. And you can't. And you really do have to make some decisions there in terms of how inclusive you're going to be. It is kind of implied, I think, that you're dealing with mercantile empires. It's implied that you're dealing with maritime history generally, and more specifically, obviously, the naval aspects of that. How do you win World War II? How do you win World War I? How do you get all that stuff across oceans? It's just kind of implied there, but I'll plead guilty. I certainly have not specifically had a lecture or had a series of discussions on the merchant marine or how that develops, and they're professionals, just like naval officers and enlisted people. They're just as How about Great Lakes sailors? I did talk briefly at one point about, can you have sea power on the Great Lakes? Well, sure you can. There's water or Lake Champlain or wherever. But again, I say I plead guilty because there's just so much you can do, and maybe we do need to carve out, maybe a day or so to be able to talk about that.
I think that's time. We can have some offline time later. But thank you very much to our panelists. Please give them a hand.